Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. My name is Paula Clemente Vega, and I'm delighted to chair today's Comics Grid webinar hosted by the Open Library of Humanities. And today's session is titled, Do I Have to Draw a Picture? Reframing Comics Scholarship, which explores comics as a form of scholarship and scholarship practice and communication. And I'm very pleased to introduce the speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Ernesto Priego, who is a co-founder and managing director of the Comics Grid, Journal of Comics Scholarship. He's also a senior lecturer at the Center for Human-Computer Interaction Design, and is also a co-director of the Data Policy and Society MSc at City St. George's University of London. As a researcher, he has explored the role of comics as a narrative, conceptual and speculative design tools, and applies participatory methods to the creation of comics within public health or social interest domains. Ernesto also led the Parables of Care, Responses to Dementia Care project that took place between 2017 and 2021, and explore the potential of comics to enhance the impact of dementia care research, and co-led as well the creation in March 2028 of the Graphic Science collection in the journal, known since 2024 as Graphic Scholarship. Then our second speaker today, good morning, Peter, is Peter Wilkins, who is a contract and community services programmer with the training group at Douglas College in Metro Vancouver, where he creates and runs programs for newcomers and marginalized youth. Before that, he taught for 20 years in the English department at Douglas College, and he has been working on comics studies since 2011, and he's also an editor of the Comics Grid Journal Scholarship, and also he's a co-editor of the Graphic Scholarship Special Collection together with Ernesto. And as well, Nicolas Labarre, who is also an editor of this special collection, and he will be our third speaker today. He's a professor in American Studies at the University Bordeaux, Montaigne in France, where he teaches US political institutions, comics, and video games. His research focuses mostly on comics, with a particular interest in issues of adaptation, genres, and transnational circulations. In addition to several pieces of comics as a scholarship, he is also the author of Heavy Metal. Not sure about my accent here, the Outre Metal Hurlant, which was published in 2017. He's also the author of a transnational history of heavy metal magazine, of the author of Understanding Genres in Comics, published in 2020, and of Moebius, which was published in 2025, and is a critical biography of Jean Girault Moebius. Very sorry about my pronunciation. Thank you all for joining us. We will aim to leave around 10-15 minutes at the end of the session for question and answers, so please feel free to post your question in the chat through the session. And we will also be recording this session, and I will upload a copy of the session to the Open Library of Humanities channel. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to the speakers, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. Hopefully you can all see the screen because we'll be sharing slides during this webinar. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being present. Thank Peter and Ernesto. When we were discussing editorial policies, and we were having what we felt was an interesting discussion, and it sounded like a good idea to have this discussion in public instead of keeping it confined to a late afternoon, early morning meeting, depending on the time zone. Also, it's there's something heartening about the idea of a global comic scholarship, to see that people from different time zones, and we did triple check the time zones to make sure that we would arrive at the meeting at the same time today. So yeah, all that is great. So the title was Peter's idea, do I have to draw a picture? And the idea was to think about the state of comics as scholarship or comics-based scholarship or graphic science, and of course the terminology matters. We started with the idea that it was perhaps 10 years later, and then when we went back to the actual chronology, it turned out that the chronology of comics as scholarship was maybe longer than what the usual landmarks would suggest. Ernesto, you were the one who filled in the chronology, so maybe you'd like to say a word, maybe just to emphasize the fact that the key moment in the chronology is probably 2015 with the publication of Nick Susasni's Unflattening, which is a moment where the idea that you could do original scholarship, publish original research in comics form really captured the imagination of the comic scholars community.
Sure, yeah. That was hello everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great, especially at relatively short notice. As Nicola was saying, yeah, we do for the comics grid for the journal. We do meet online. We do most of our editorial work. Well, all of it mostly is online, and one day we had such a good. Well, we thought it was a very stimulating conversation around this topic, and we're like, it would be nice to invite other people around to help us think about this matter. So this is a, you will excuse I mean, with the topic that we have, this is a terrible slide to show, given that it's only text. But we had text and images, and then I ended up adding so many what I thought were milestones. But you know, it's dangerous as well because you end up excluding important stuff as well. So seriously, it's no offense if we have excluded something that you know, could and should be there. So that book on flattening by Nick, I don't know if Nick managed to come today, but was his PhD thesis, right? And later it was published as it is a monograph in comics form. So the fact that Nick graduated from an American university, well-known university with a you know, practice-based PhD, I suppose, with a dissertation in a form as a comic was really groundbreaking. So it's been 11 years of that already. But I also wanted to include other dates there. So it is interesting that the first comics forum, the first one I went to was in 2010, and that was like, for me personally, a very important event in Leeds. But really the very first one was in 2009. And it was titled Possibilities and Perspectives, a Conference on Comics. And 2010 was a year in which the Comics Grid starts as a blog, and following also, you know, meetups that we had in conferences. So the first graphic medicine conference in London was in 2010. Also the first transitions symposium, a PhD symposium, that was the caption was, or the subtitle was, New Directions in Comic Studies. The Journal of Comics and Graphic Novels and Studies in Comics do start publishing. Then that conference that you came to as well, right, Peter, in 2011 to Alcalá de Henares. I could not go to that one, but you know, there was a lot of activity, you know, in those years. The Joint International Conference of Graphic Novels and Comics in Manchester Metropolitan University was in that same year, 2011, and Jimenez Lai was in attendance. And in 2012, he would publish Citizens of No Place, an architectural graphic novel that you know, Roberto Bartual, our colleague, also wrote about that comic. Roberto was in the conference. Roberto was one of the founding members of the Comics Grid, Digital Humanities Quarterly, Asteroid Belter before. And so we are trying to paint like with only words here, sorry, but that picture of this number of years, right? It's been 16, 17 years of sequential activity. where there's been a common ground, a common topic of not just comic scholar. Like, what do we mean by it? So this was the thing, right? Even when we were thinking about titles for or subtitles for the event, in the comics grid, when we thought it should be the Journal of Comics Scholarship, what we thought this is scholarship about comics, right? But in English, to have the comics as an adjective, right, and scholarship as a noun, could also lead to being interpreted as scholarship in comics form, right? Even though normally we have used other terms to mean that, right? So we say also like comics research, and we would say, okay, that is research about comics. So normally in the standard traditional form of writing, right, an essay, a critical engagement with about the comic, or based or employing other scholarship. But yeah, so I wanted to open with that, with the idea that the whole notion of comic scholarship, of comic studies, of studies about comics, can also lends itself to, and has probably not always, but at least in this time lapse, in this period of time, could be said to also include thinking that and practicing comics as a form of research, right, or a form of scholarship.
Yes, and you see that there's a very short interval between the institutionalization of comic studies in the form of all of these journals getting started, studies in comics, journals of comics and graphic novels, Comicalité in France, these journals getting started, and in just 5 years moving to explore other ideas about what comics scholarship can mean. I hasten to say that in French, bande dessinée de recherche doesn't have the same ambiguity. So these are understood as two different fields. And there's been a lot of interest in France also with the matter, but without that founding ambiguity.
Interesting, yeah. Yes.
Also, what's striking in this chronology is that the moment unflattening appears, and again, as you indicated, this is in the sequence of other works and reflections and people experimenting with the form and discussing the possibilities. But the moment it appears, you see a sequence of works being published. So unflattening, then Sequentials, which is a journal published by the University of Florida, has its first CFP the following year. The Comics Grid has its first opens its graphic science collection 2 years later, but very much as a in the context of sequentials being a thing and unflattening being published. And again, in France and elsewhere, many examples of institutions and researchers and scholars working with the form, and as if something had happened in several places across the world, and you see that on several occasions in the history of comics itself, that is the same phenomenon happening across the world because people have the same idea based on the same zeitgeist, I suppose. And this is very much we have a milestone, but also this is something that was bubbling up in different places.
Absolutely. This is slightly a very Anglo-centric view, but also, I mean, it's also a personal, point of view of where we were at the time, or where we have been. We have two examples there, one from Nick's on flattening, and the other by Lydia Wysocki, and from Asteroid Belter.
And this is from the first issue of Sequentials, an example by the Vimmel books, the Where is Charlie books, and using the form to articulate the argument. And all of these examples are great in that they show that there is something afoot in the idea of using comics to produce original scholarship, as opposed to just illustrating scholarship, which is one of the key divide that we wanted to investigate today. And this is the first example of graphic science published on the Comics Grid, and also an article which we used. We took the image to advertise this conference from this article by Matteo Farinella, which is about microscopes and metaphors. So the thinking about visual analogies in science more broadly through comics, which is an interesting hall of mirrors.
Yeah, I'll try to share the direct link to the article so people can check it out. But this was it the first article in the collection, Nicolas? Probably, right?
I think it was
one of the first. Yeah, I'll find it so I can share it. I consider this a very advanced example. I mean, Matteo was already also working with the form for non-fiction sciencey comics for a while, right? And it is, in a way, for me, it represents an ideal, right? But it does not necessarily mean that should be the benchmark for against which
and we'll talk about labor
yeah.
and skills and proficiency, graphic proficiency.
Yeah.
Peter, I remember that when we were in Liège, I think, for the Poetics of the Algorithm conference, you and Ernesto suggested that we open this collection, and I was wondering if you remember what the thinking was.
I can't remember what my thinking was yesterday, so I don't know if I can remember back to 2018. I think what's interesting for me here is creating a distinction between using drawing in research, which has a long scholarly history, and using comics as a way of thinking, or as a way of thinking about a subject, and also thinking about what subjects are thinking about comics useful for, and maybe what subjects are not suited to comics. I think we've sort of, like, from the timeline, there was a kind of an enthusiasm for looking at comics as a mode of presentation of research ideas. And I'm wondering if we've got beyond that initial enthusiasm so that we're no longer just talking about comics are great, they're good for all kinds of things, they use words and images, and something more advanced than that. In looking at comics graphic scholarship, I've seen a lot of examples of that talk about how comics is great for doing research, but we haven't moved, I don't think, yet into a place where people are using comics to do research without that sort of reflexivity to it, if that makes sense. So in a way, we're kind of stuck in a wheel of talking about how comics are great, and there's a little bit of an absence of critical thinking about what comics are actually good for. For instance, I think we have to think about what counts for knowledge in different disciplines, and whether you can use comics in science in the same way that you can use it in the arts, for instance. But I come at this from a position of interest rather than expertise. So these are just things that are percolating. I really think that distinction between the comic as a kind of packaging of research, or what I would call like a step-down transformer, so that, you know, comics really are for kids. They make scientific concepts easy to understand, and comics as an exploratory tool.
Yes, like the differences between comics as process, or, you know, components of methodologies, you know, or even a methodology in themselves, and
Yes.
and comics as a mean. I mean, it's not mutually exclusive, but comics as a means to talk about.
I'm also really interested in the difference between conducting research through creating comics and receiving the ideas of those comics as an audience or a reader. Because I do think there's great value to making comics about what you are doing in research, because it allows for this incredible reflection as you draw. But as you receive the information, do you go through the same kind of in-depth process.
Sure, and I mean, this is the striking factor that unflattening was about images, and Matteo's example, which we displayed on screen a minute ago, was also about images. So this idea that comics might be suited to discuss images because they rely on visual metaphors, and there's also an argument for graphic science, graphic scholarship, which is that to draw forces you to defamiliarize what you're talking about, what you are writing about. That in drawing, you have to reimagine the very process of discussing science, and also to think about the embodiment and the process, and in a sense, to move away from a kind of automatic academic writing in which you are following an established style. So because you have to reinvent the layout, you have to reinvent the drawings, you have to decide how you want to present yourself. All of these are norms in academic writing. Because you have to think through these codes and norms and conventions, then you have this reflexive process in which you are essentially doing better research because you are questioning everything. So all of that is great, but also, as you suggested, Peter, it might not apply to everything. So again, drawing has an established pedigree in science through diagrams and various stylized representations, but comics specifically, maybe that's not applicable to every subject, or maybe it's not productive in the same way when applied to different subjects. So this reflection led us to revise the comics grid guidelines, which was longer. On the left, you have the original guidelines that we used, which acknowledge the fact that this was a novelty and that we were working our way through the possibilities of comics, graphic science, comics scholarship. And it was this winter that we went with the the revised guidelines on the right, which is shorter, more to the point, and which is also a way to try and avoid the number of submissions which we received, which were often great, but not suited to what we understood to be graphic scholarship. I don't know if either of you want to elaborate, or I can go on.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Peter.
Sorry. I think, yeah, you start to receive, I think this is also true of graphic medicine to an extent, and that is you sort of start to see the same kind of piece over and over again. And I think that was a real issue, right? A kind of repetition of an idea and not a moving on from that idea.
I think that we also, I mean, this was part of a larger prompt to make sure that, over the years, because the journal started in 2010. So by 2025, we had been over, 15 years of working, trying to keep the journal alive with content and, going through the changes of being a blog, and then experimenting with different formats. Brad Brooks is in the audience, and he will remember when we were experimenting to do digital publishing at the time. Thank you, Brad. That will never be forgotten. We did the Comics Grid first compilation. At the time, we were really keen on also showing that there was, good things to do, good thinking to do about comics online. I mean, originally in shorter forms, we thought, and that academics could also take the lead on learning how to publish. That it was not a thing of academics only thinking about stuff and maybe writing a manuscript and then sending it for review and then revising, but then being separated from the actual process of producing the work as a publication. As soon as I can, I will share the link to the year 1 compilation that I'm talking about that Brad helped designing or designed. But what I was thinking about is that we've been through all of these iterations. So historically, thinking has evolved, right? And also, as you have like an online platform, you write stuff and then you modify things, and then there may be, sections change, and then there'll be overlaps and duplications. So anyway, prompted by our publishers, the Open Library of Humanities, we revised all of the website, all of the information about the journal, and including all of the guidelines, and it was an ideal moment to revise the specific guidelines for what we renamed from graphic science to graphic scholarship. And Nicolas was key, because Nicolas has always been our main section editor. That's the other thing to say, that it used to be, we thought, okay, we do have a collection, and technically speaking, all the articles that are in comics form published in the grid have been collected as a collection, and that's how we thought about it. But we used to think that articles in comics form could belong to different sections, so that they could be research or interviews or commentaries, or even reviews. And then we rethought that and went for considering graphic scholarship a section in itself. So even if the pieces maybe or are researchy or are research in comics form, they go in a section called graphic scholarship rather than the section which is research. And that's why that section, it's a category of article, right? It's a type of article, a type of submission. And therefore we thought we needed to think harder about what it is that we wanted. Also because, as Peter says, we started seeing perhaps there was a misalignment between what the journal was giving the impression was hoping to receive and what we were receiving. And in my experience, in my personal interpretation of the phenomenon, it also had to do with stuff that we actually did get to publish at some point in the history of the journal. Because our thinking about it was evolving. And with the popularity of graphic medicine as a type of comics activity, of practice-based research in some cases, but it is often subjective or positioned like a research that positions the author and the empirical author at the forefront sometimes. So then the boundaries between autobiography or memoir or a personal perspective on a phenomenon that may be related to science or to medicine maybe become something that may not necessarily be, it could be autoethnographic research, right? But it is, we were thinking, we are trying to develop something slightly different to what, say, graphic medicine, or say what the medical journals that publish works by doctors are publishing at the moment.
And we also received a number of pieces that were about dissemination and popularizing ideas as opposed to original research, and which is why we went with the new guidelines to something more straightforward. The piece published in this collection must fulfill the same functions as traditional scholarly articles. So trying to, the previous guidelines had all this idea of promoting comics as a form of scientific communication, and it ended with develop comics about their practices, research data, and insights for dissemination and impact, which was absolutely fine. And as you both indicated, we did publish pieces that fit this description, but also there was something, it felt like something of a dead end, something that would not produce original research, which was what we were really aiming for and hoping to promote. And especially since this is not the slide, but this is something that is related to the difficulty of publishing comic scholarship. But one of the difficulties that we had is that we received submissions on subjects for which we had no expertise at all, which goes back to Peter's point. There were submissions about musical trends and about various scientific endeavors for which we were ill-equipped. So there's also there was also the realization that we were not in a position to properly review these graphic comics, these graphic research with the tools that we had. So we could have a review that focused on the comic-y part. We could have a review that focused on the scientific part, but these were disjointed. So again, to come back to Peter's point, asking the question, what is this good for? And also, what can we do and how should we proceed when we have unusual articles and we want to have a sort of scientific rigor applied to the submissions?
Yes, if I may, in this slide, what we are trying to show, on the left, you see a screenshot of a fragment of the comic of the article. Even in the way I speak about it, it shows that we are in this how do you say this? Yeah, in this place between things and phenomena. But yeah, this screenshot from the article by Matteo Farinella from 2018. So it's a screenshot. It's an image, right? I mean, as a file, as an image file, as a digital file, is an image file. I took a screenshot, so it's a PNG. And on the PowerPoint, we inserted it as a file, as an image file. This image file contains text and images, and some of the images or the drawings are drawn by the author. And others are, include also images of other comics or references to other comics, or in this case, Crazy Cat by, well-known author, right? But notice how in the image we see in the article itself, in the screenshot from the article itself, the fragment from the article itself, what we see is that there is text that is citing in text, right? There are references in Harvard format of author, year, right? Those correspond to in the other section. What we have is the text is a copy pasted text from the article itself, and you can check this again. If you just joined us, you may not be able to see the chat. What happened before? I think maybe, I don't know. I can't remember if that works like that in Teams. So I am repeating it on the chat. You can see the article yourselves, but what we've been doing in the grid is that we have the articles in comics form. The comics component of the article is, yes, images, even if those images contain text, but we wrap the whole thing with pure manuscript text, which would be the metadata often, and sometimes there are longer introductions providing context to the piece, how it was created, etc. Stuff that is important for the author to talk about, but that is not presented in the comic itself. But particularly when it comes to references, in order to facilitate scholarship as we do it in the 21st century, so that people know when they have been cited, and so that you can access the resources that an author has cited. They are in text with hyperlinks that are clickable, etc. Right? So this has caused confusion, right? Continues to cause confusion. We have tried to explain it to the best of our abilities, and some authors seem to get it right away, and others do struggle more with that. But basically, what an author would need is a Word file where you would have your title, your abstract, your keywords, any acknowledgements, and your references as text, as a traditional article. And that would go wrapping the main body of your text in comics form, right? So if you download the PDF or if you see it online, you will be better, you will be able to understand better what I am trying to describe, right? So this is perhaps a workaround. I mean, I can imagine there may be more sophisticated ways to hyperlink images and text, etc., right? So that, ideally, just like you can now click on links on PDFs, for example, that if the comic originally was a PDF, that you should be able to embed a PDF for publication in the, but the way the whole system that scholarly publishing still relies on, which is a particular way of form of typesetting that relies on hyperlinking. We need to keep those links working, right? And we need to keep that text to be searchable, discoverable, because if we only published flat images, no one would ever find an article, and I obviously cannot, I just have to believe that Kohn 2014 or Jurishevich and Horvath 2016, right? And then I may be able to read the references that have been drawn or included in the body of that comic, but I would not be able to click on the link to go to the article, when those resources exist online. Sorry for that, took too long.
This is a problem that we haven't exactly solved, but in my experience working with other journals, there's been a variety of non-solutions. That is, I had a paper version of a comic scholarship article that could not be reprinted in the digital version because the managers of the journals flat out refused, said we cannot cannot reach the standards of discoverability that we expect from the journal. And at other times I was asked to provide a complete description of every single image and a complete transcript of every text included in the comic. So all of these solutions exist, and also at other times I was just asked for the flat pictures. So we've struggled with this, but I think everyone has. And one of the important aspects of reflecting on the history of comic scholarship is thinking about incentives versus the drawbacks. So there's a clear incentive to drawing these comics, to being the first to do it. That's so much is clear. But being 10 years on, the novelty has worn off, and the drawbacks are perhaps more prominent because you have to accept that your article will be less easily discovered, especially if you do not benefit from all the publicity that the first pioneers received when they tried to do it. Especially I think if you publish in a comics journal, such as the Comics Grid, from another discipline, which may also be disincentivize authors from trying to publish actual new research as opposed to dissemination. So we had just a few slides to think about the idea that perhaps that moment of enthusiasm is gone. And this is just a series of quick examples, but I wanted to suggest that the idea of using comics to deal with serious matters, to educate, to transmit information is nothing new. So this is from the late 19th century. This is the Images d'Épinal, and this was used to educate, but also it was used for propaganda purpose. There's a one about eugenics and trying to teach poor people that eugenics was actually good for them. So all in the late 19th century. The mid 20th century had a number of promotional comics that often present themselves as science comics. So this is from the Atomic Revolution, and everything is heavily documented. Everything is based on engineer drawings, and all of that very much speaks with the language of science, even though it is meant as a promotional tool to support an industry. And there's literally a comic book for every American industry in the mid 20th century. I recently published an article about railroad comics, which I cannot recommend. I mean, the article, yes, but the comic books, not so much. So there's a long history, but also there's at least, so these are French examples, but on this idea that the enthusiasm may have worn off. These are two collections that were published by mainstream publishers in France. The first published adaptations and original works of sociology in comics form, called Sociorama, and it lasted from 2016, again the same years, to 2020. The second one is called La Petite Bibliothèque des Savoirs, essentially pocket encyclopedias or pocket guidebooks to certain topics using comics authors. This is Winchlus, author of Pinocchio and many others on the right, and this lasted from 2016 to 2019. So the same time frame, the idea of this, that there might have been an explosion of these science-driven comics, and then something of a disillusionment. This is something that we felt at the Comics Grid, that there was a corrective was needed, not going back on the idea, but perhaps reframing it. And mainstream publishers, at least in France, went through the same process. That is embracing the idea of comics drawn from science or drawn or truly publishing original research, and then realizing that maybe the market wasn't there for such production. And all of that, I think, goes to a crucial distinction. That is the idea that what we now want for the graphic science collection, what we now call for is original research, and this is hard to do. There are actually few examples of that, but there's a number of examples of disseminating science, using comics productively to achieve other communicative goals. And we have several examples of that, but it seems striking to me that Nick Sousanis's work immediately after Unflattening the Fragile Framework was, in a sense, meant to communicate the urgency of action of climate action. This was for one of the climate summits, but and not original research.
Yeah, which is also, you know, in a way, it's so significant that it would have been published in Nature of all journals, right? But that it is the comic adapts the research, right? Rather than presenting. It is, we could argue it's part of the research because you have to, there is research involved in doing it, but the intention of the output itself would be to disseminate someone else's original research, let's say, right? So that is one of the distinctions.
I think, if I could interject here, I think that please. There is a kind of lapsing into the packaging of knowledge through comics rather than exploring knowledge through comics because of kind of inability to get past a few ideas, or an inability to look at a term like graphic, for instance. I mean, I'll spend all day talking to people and telling them any novel is a graphic novel. It's got print, right? That's graphic. It's not a question of whether something is graphic or not. It's a question of whether it includes pictorial depictions of something or not. Nick Sousanis's book is called Unflattening, and the beginning of the book talks a lot about being liberated from text into something else, right? But drawing is flattening. It's not unflattening. It's still working in two dimensions. So there is a kind of, I think that there's a kind of thinking that we have to do that we have yet to undertake that could really transform graphic scholarship. I mean, the whole question of the apparatus seems to me that, you know, the escape from conventional research is never quite complete because you're always tying it back into a system of references and text. And I think it's very interesting, but that we're not necessarily exploring the really interesting parts right? For instance, if you think philosophically, right, some things have images and some things don't. If you think about the sublime, for instance, that's a concept that doesn't have an image. And so, what do you do with that if you want to talk about something that has no images? All right, Ernesto, you can take it back now.
Your mic is off, Ernesto.
Sorry, yeah, I was obviously still processing what Peter had said. We had that slide, but as an example, perhaps, of what we don't mean in this case. Like we would not submit this to our own collection, not only because we are editors of the journal, maybe even though we have published in our own journal, but because it is an example of thinking about comics as a way to enhance research insights already presented in a different way. In this case, we actually adapted data, right? Like research data into short stories, trying to communicate the lived experience of carers of people living with dementia. The only reference there is to the original research, right? So again, it is, I see it as connected to all this movement towards trying to understand what are the things that we can do with comics, right? What kind of, all the different kinds of thinking and maybe knowledge production that you can do with comics. But that today we are trying to share here, to do some kind of live shared public thinking about what would be the difference when we are trying to achieve, comics as original research. If that's one way of putting it, Nicolas, you think?
Sure. Yeah, but also I'm thinking that Parables of Care is a brilliant example of using some of the affordances of comics, in particular the idea that you can bridge the specific and the general, that the bodies that are represented on the page are always specific in that they have specific bodily affordances, but at the same time, they can be drawn from several examples. They don't have to be to refer to a specific individual. So that's a very specific affordance of comics that is used in Parables of Care, and that works. I'm thinking but also, so this is from Nick Susanis's blog. This is a mini comic that he uses as a syllabus for his superhero course. And on the right, I have my own introduction, a page for my own mini comic about the Mobius book. And in all of these cases, other affordances of comics are being used. That is, they can be cheaply distributed. They can create this immediate legibility that you do not get from a text piece. So using the various affordances of comics to do science or to produce knowledge or to introduce knowledge, these are not meant for dissemination so much as to, again, create entry points into science. Sorry, Peter? Right. Entry points into science. That using various affordances, and since it's 10 to 7, just wanted perhaps to ask a question about what we mean when we say comics scholarship. Because so far we've talked about comics as if it was non-problematic. We do comic scholarship or comic science. And in some cases, comic scholarship does resemble comics. There are characters and world balloons. So this is Pierre Nocerino, who has published whose PhD was about the labor of comics writers and of comics authors, and who's done sociology work in comics form and using some of the same affordances that you both used in Parables of Care. That is, being able to connect the general and the particular through specific examples, but also bringing in the scientific apparatus. But also you have many examples, and sorry, this is one of mine, but calling it, which I would call graphic science, but probably not comics. because what the piece uses some of the affordances of comics, that is the ability to control the layout and to have a clear hierarchy of ideas and the ability to include illustrations without presenting them as examples or extraneous material, but as being part of what is being discussed. But also, is this comics? Does this count as comics? I'm not sure. I would probably call it that. But so in a way, the graphic science is a better description than comic scholarship, in that what we want authors to rely in, I think, is the broader affordances of the printed page or the fully designed page, in which text and image can interact and produce meaning, as opposed to just relying on the idea of comics as importing everything, the culture of comics, your superheroes, your Asterix, your One Piece. This is specifically something that we are not interested in, whereas this is very much a part of the shared understanding of what comics mean.
Yes, this is something that I've also encountered also in my peer review and editorial work. And like we have some, there's one article, remember the one with a note that we published by you, Nicolas, back in the day on the zombies. There were notes, right? Like using the affordances of comics for research notes, for thinking. And then, yeah, you have something else which is not, it's not a comic, right? But that's also been it's also part of the debate, like, and I hate to do that, because I don't want to suggest that I am saying we should go back to debating, definitions of comics. And obviously there's been that recent interesting project by on literally called Comics Is, in which different thinkers, different colleagues to have a dialogue in writing about what comics is or are. But I think it continues to be an interesting thing to reflect, and somehow it seems to me that just like some of the great filmmakers, at least of the 20th century, were also reflecting on the nature of film, it seems to me that comics could be a great way to also reflect on what we mean by comics. Yeah, not sure if I'm making sense. Yeah.
I think maybe we should mention Simon Grennan's work here, because I think that's a form of research through comics that is very interesting, which is the inhabiting of other works, and the interrogation of other works by making comics about them, like the work on Trollope, for instance, right? What does it mean to adapt and change the original material? Yeah, I included a few things that I thought were kind of germane to the discussion, particularly things like technical drawing, scientific illustration, and their relationship to comics. And this volume, which I highly recommend, Moby Dick in Pictures by Matt Kish, which is he took every page of the I can't remember what edition. It was like the pocketbook edition of Moby Dick, and for each page he drew a picture, and it's kind of like pictures from the text imposed on found paper, which sort of simulates the grid of comics. And it's just a really interesting way of sort of interrogating something else through the comics medium.
All right. I don't know if how much longer we have. It seems to me that if we wanted to have questions, a Q&A with the people who are still with us, maybe this is the time to do so.
Sure thing. Yeah, I think that would be great, because we can yeah, keep on talking and not involving the audience.
You can start posting your questions in the chat if you have any question.
Someone shared with me privately some feedback on the Sublime, Peter, saying the Sublime never had content, visual or linguistic. That is the whole thing about the Sublime.
Yes, and I think that's well, my interpretation of the Sublime is that it's something you can cognize, you can conceive, but you can't represent, right? Like infinity, for instance. And that on the opposite of that is the beautiful, which is something that is eminently representable, but at some level inconceivable.
So you are saying that that poses an interesting challenge for researching comics form?
Like there are things that you can talk about, but that you can't draw pictures of, to put it just super bluntly, right? And there are things that you can draw pictures of that you can't really talk about. And it's the latter that I think is really interesting for comics as an exploratory tool.
So why not like the presentation of presenting a fictional characters talking about the Sublime in comics form? Would that?
Well, the minute you say you can't draw a picture of something, everybody tries to draw a picture of it, which I think is very fascinating, right? Like the volume that I included. It's one of the things that Ishmael says in Moby Dick is that the whale must remain unpainted to the last, right? It is a sublime thing. And then, of course, we have volumes and volumes of paintings of the whale that emanate from that statement. So I think that's interesting. Like, what can we draw and put in the visual array that we can't say? And I do think there's, if you look at, I know Nicolas and I talk about this from time to time, and that is, when do the comics fall back on text, right? When do they leave looking to go back to reading, or when do they leave seeing to go back to reading? And it's like the language is always a supplement to the image, but in true deconstructive thinking, that supplement is really the important thing. Like, are we ever escaping flattening? To use Suzanne as a start.
And perhaps related to that is, I think the fact there is no prescribed mode of engagement with pictures. That is, when you see people reading comics, it's quite clear that some people will just skim over the images and focus on the text. I mean, regular comics, while others will try to spend time with the image and look at the mark making and the actual drawing. And because we cannot prescribe the way people will interact with the images, whereas we have more, I think, robust protocols for engaging with text. We know that we are expected to read every word, but you're not expected to look for every mark on the page. So because we have these varied modes of engagements, it's very hard to leverage images to do what you want them to do. If you could rely on, again, an established protocol, whereby you know that every mark on the page is going to be read and made meaningful, then perhaps you could use the image to produce maybe not the sublime, but at least to approach the depth of that we associate with prose. But again, if people just skim your image, then it's lost. And it seems to me that one of the most effective mode of visual communication that you find in the successful pieces of graphic scholarship are the idea of using the whole page as a picture and then fragmenting that picture, or using an overwhelming visual metaphor that defines, that organizes the piece, and then having this idea that you can go from the general to the specific, whereas in prose you always have to go from the specific to the general. But if comics fail to use that that difference of scale between the page and the panel, then you're left with an easy supplement or an easy mode of expression. And again, I think the lack of a reading protocol, of an agreed upon reading protocol, especially because we do not consume scientific articles the way we consume mainstream comics or for entertainment. We do not do the same thing with a scientific article that we would were we reading a tome of Bachman or One Piece. So it's quite clear that there is something lacking here. And that it's a limit, it's a severe constraint on what we can do with these images. Sorry, it was a bit rambling, but it seems to me that there's something crucial there.
This is what happens if people don't ask questions. We just rabble on. But I think it really, comics as scholarship really makes us rethink discursivity, reading, and like the accumulation of information as we look at something, right? Because I don't know where people get this idea that reading comics is somehow easier than reading prose. I find it deeply unsettling and fragmenting, right? My eyes going all over the place. I'm meant to track from left to right to top to bottom, but at the same time, my eyes going all over the page. And as you say, like, how deeply do you look at the image? One of the interesting things I thought about digital comics was the way that you could go frame by frame and expand things so that you could look more deeply into the image than you would necessarily on a piece of paper. And I just found that kind of fascinating. I mean, I think this is my qualm with people like Cohn's argument that, you know, you have this visual language which operates more or less the same as regular language. It doesn't really pay attention to the unsettling nature of comics. Maybe it's true, but as the Dante scholar John Frachero once said, some things are true but uninteresting. I think what's interesting about comics is that sort of defiance of language at some level.
Yes, but at the same time, of language, you mean written language?
Yeah, like text, right?
Yes. And yeah, and I was thinking along those lines that there seems to be several things going on at the same time, but you mentioned digital comics, and I feel like there's been a trend, or a certain trend. It's not like there's the only one, but towards more minimalism in terms of the use of text in comics, and also that digital platforms, specifically social media platforms, or the Instagram, etc., where comic strips are either remediated for the app itself, or people that are creating comics or comics-like material for those platforms, are constrained by those settings, just like the early 20th century comic strip artists were constrained by the space that they had available to have a comic in the newspaper, right, or in a magazine. And but there's this, on the one hand, there's that sort of like minimalism, like not too much text, and therefore also not too many panels, at least per comic, and then which is a little bit at odds with the detail that is normally associated with research, right, or with scholarship, because also scholarship tends to mean engagement with other texts or with other ideas that have been presented as text. On the other hand, you have work like Nick's Susanis, which is very sophisticated and lots to look at and lots to read, that maybe also like rooted in the work like Blake and Mortimer, or even why not Tantan, or the whole Clear Line School in France and Belgium, in which you look at those comics now and you're like, oh my God, children and young people used to read a lot of text in comics.
Yes.
Right?
You have a question. Somebody has a question.
Yeah. So, okay, there I am with my great ideas. And you...
It is a great idea, but we have to jump on the questions as they come. Somebody's asking about indigenous comics and graphic novels from Northeast India, and can we shed light on how to read works that are largely based on oral history? I can't answer that question, but I can say, like, I was listening to an audiobook of Anais Nin's diary, and I thought, oh, this is really abstract and very kind of hard to get a grip on. And then I discovered that there was a graphic adaptation of it, and I was sort of able to put the pictures and the words together in a new way. But I can't answer that question directly. Perhaps Nicola or Ernesto can.
Yeah, I started answering in the chat, but it seems to me that one of the it is very tempting to treat documentary comics as documents. I mean, comics based on real life as documents, just providing information in raw form. We can do that. We can certainly do that. We can read them for their informative value. But if we want to engage with these comics, we have to take them seriously as comics, and we also have to ask what their limitations are, what graphic styles they use. I'm struck in particular. I was asked to review dissertation for a master's degree done in comics form last year, and the other, this was an anthropology work. This was very interesting, but the other had not thought about the history, the visual history that he was bringing to the work. So he brought in conventions, he brought in codes, but he had nothing to say about them. He used them without seeing them. So in a way, he was not doing the reflexive work that we were mentioning earlier, the idea that graphic scholarship is about questioning your own practices and reinventing your own language, or something that is not language, to echo what Peter was saying, but or reinventing something that can substitute for language. And if you just bring in conventions, you're doing something else, which might be very effective, and which I think talks to Fran's question in the chat, which is who is asking how comic scholarship relates to popular comics and their production or reception. And it seems to me that there's something crucial, there's a crucial nexus here. The crucial nexus is that for institutions, comics is understood as a magical tool. Is for dissemination. That is, you produce a comic, and because it has the same form, the same shape, the same apparatus as a form of popular culture, it becomes popular. That's not how it works. Comics are not popular culture unless they are distributed, marketed, sold, and received as such. So unless you can enter the channels of distribution, unless you can embrace the unspoken conventions, the hero, the recurring character, the physical appearance of the object, unless you can bring in all of that in your science comics, then you're not going to get the effect that you're looking for, because there's no magical tool. You can do something that has all the same digital tools as a Hollywood blockbuster. It will not be a Hollywood blockbuster, because Hollywood blockbusters rely on promotions, marketing, distribution, institutions. So graphic science is often misunderstood as this, again, magic tool. And for the first practitioners, it had some of that effect because of curiosity, because people were looking for the novelty effect. But right now, not so much. So institutions produce these things and they don't know how to distribute them. I mean, comics for dissemination, unless they rely on an established network. And again, Parables of Care was well distributed. It reached the people it was trying to reach, but it was not, I think, understood as competing with or occupying the same ground as popular comics.
My answer to Fran's question is, I can remember being at the Alcalá conference, the first graphic novels and comics conference or whatever, and I think it was Pedro Moura who said, we're all here because we read X-Men when we were 15.
Yeah, it's an interesting, yeah, I also remember images during the Fantastic Four, especially Jack Kirby, not only because, of his previous comics in science fiction, but specifically the Fantastic Four, and there were some incredible panels that were basically infographics right? and rooted in that tradition of some of those early examples that you showed in the presentation. So it's a bit of an aside, but it relates to those. I mean, there are likely very interesting connections between I guess popular comics, like popular culture comics, or people who read comics as and understand them as part of popular culture, could probably have a shock of conflict of horizons of expectations when suddenly you have a comic that has citations or maybe too serious or or whatever. But I think the possibilities there are very cool and open-ended. There's another question question about have you seen it, Pippin K? It says, if, as Nick Susani suggests, argument itself can be built visually rather than explained verbally, especially in scientific or historical contexts, and given that comics drawings may not fully do justice to real images, I guess this means, well, I don't know what are real images. Wouldn't there be contradictions between image and text? I am also thinking about misinterpretation since readers are subjective. How do we account for that?
Well, images and very quickly, images and texts are rarely complementary in comics, right? There's always a what would you say, a fissure between them. All right, Nicolas, I'll let you go after.
No, I was just thinking that you could argue that by redrawing the images, we also make them more legible. So we remove the ambiguity. It's very. I worked on Shaun of the Dead and Jara in Shaun of the Dead, and part of the work was had to do with redrawing the film frames in order to keep only the meaningful content. That is, to remove everything that was extraneous to the demonstration and to remove the. I mean, a film frame is fraught with ambiguity, is filled with random elements that are especially obvious when you don't have the movement of the camera apparatus just focusing your attention on something. So you take any film frame, it's mysterious. But if you redraw the film frame to call attention to something that you want to call attention to, it can become more effective. And there's something in art history. In art history, it's not uncommon to redraw the silhouettes of the things that you want to call attention to in order to label them. So comics or redrawn images can also have this this edge over more referential images, which I think what you mean by real images, that is documents and various pieces of visual evidence that are brought in the article.
Who among us has not looked at a set of IKEA instructions and gone, fuck this, I'm looking at YouTube? Right, there's that, like, what does a drawing do, or a sequence of drawings in comic book form do that's different from a video or a photograph? Why even have, like, say, biological technical drawing, for instance, when you can just take a photograph of a thing? And I think it has to do with what Nicolas is saying, is that drawing is always, I'm sure photography and film is as well, but perhaps more obviously, drawing is always an interpretation of whatever it is. It is through the process of transcribing what one sees, it produces automatically an interpretation, right? And a style as well.
And reproducing an understanding, because to draw something, you have to understand that thing. So you are, in a way, passing on that understanding to someone else. It's very striking when you do. I mean, when you look at traditional comics artists. Again, I worked on Giro, Möbius a lot, and just looking at the mark making, at the actual drawings, that is, how do you reconstruct a three-dimensional object on the page using marks that have nothing to do with the nature and texture. And when you start understanding that, you see a worldview that appears, that coheres in the mark making, and that worldview is an understanding that you can pass on. So yes, there's ambiguity And again, affordances, I have to agree. Going to seeing a technical drawing of a complex operation, IKEA assembly kit or anything, and then realize, nah, this is not, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my body. Am I supposed to flip this over? Where does this go? But at other times, also realizing that because again, affordances and because the complex three-dimensional movements are hard to reproduce in comics form or drawn forms, but other things are so great in comics, and knowing exactly in which hole you're supposed to put the little peg, that's better done with a technical drawing than with with a YouTube video, which you have to pause and manually count. Is that what is that?
Yeah, there's the other level as well of not just the reception, but the creation, as also Nicolas was signaling, and how constructionist learning, shows how, and neurological studies show how there's literally sensorial, an electric signal to the brain from doing things with our hands and drawing, with whatever tool that may be used, is making us reflect on the source material and work through the source material in arguably different ways. But I also think, there's also something very interesting in that question that suggests that, we're thinking as well about the different layers of interpretation, right? And it also, I think, the kind of comics we're talking about can also make us interrogate, supposed rigor or objectivity of different types of images or visual representations of stuff or phenomena.
When we were doing the second volume of Parables of Care, I know how this ends. We had an artist who was going to do the comic book drawing who dropped out unexpectedly. And so I had to do it. And I don't think anybody would look at what was produced and say that's a great work of art. But the experience of drawing it was an incredible experience in terms of understanding dementia. There was just something about drawing these people and their emotions and what they were going through that was a lot deeper for me than just being behind the scenes.
Yes. Yes. Okay. How are we doing for time? Do we think
we may be wrapping this up? People are gradually leaving the chat.
Sorry, Paula.
I was just saying that we still have 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if there were any more questions then, but we still have 10 minutes more in theory, but we'd reached an interesting point of conclusion, I think, of semi-conclusion for the time being. We have another question there. Should we go for that one since they are here and then maybe conclude after that? Yeah. I wanted to make myself clear regarding the question. For instance, I recently read The People of the Indus, a graphic non-fiction work that reconstructs everyday life in the Indus Valley civilization based on archaeological evidence. And I noticed several instances where the visual reconstruction seems to misrepresent the actual archaeological site. Would this risk spreading correct information?
Absolutely. But then every act of knowledge, every act of research does that. And that's why we have correctives, right? That's why we link onto it and say, no, that's not right. This is how it was.
It is equivalent. This is why, at least for our section in the journal, work submitted needs to go through peer review, and it is a complex task because it involves checking things like that. So just like you fact check written text, you would fact check visual representations, no? Or the visual components of comics. If they are pretending to be realistic, right? If they are pretending to be an accurate representation of reality.
And I would argue that most popular nonfiction, in comics form or not, does contain inaccuracies and misrepresentation, often for the sake of clarity, sometimes because of shoddy research. But in this, it seems to me that what you are describing here is more of a product of again, the production process. There was no peer review because often popular nonfiction does not include peer review, or if it does, it doesn't include the kind of rigorous peer review that is supposed to happen when something gets published in a journal. But I would not say this is specific to graphic scholarship or graphic nonfiction.
I would say that also, graphic medicine as a field that has become incredibly popular. Also, like anything that becomes larger and requires, that verification of, going back and check, okay, are we doing things correctly? Are we having the right safeguards, etc.? I personally think that it is possible for graphic medicine to misrepresent very easily, or to present false information, right? It is a challenge in academia as well of peer review of this kind of work. So maybe another webinar that we could have is like how to peer review comic scholarship, graphic scholarship, right? We have had this problem. It's taken so long as well because so you need a domain expert, but you also need a domain expert who understands comics, right? And finding them and getting them to review the same piece is more difficult than it may seem. So that's a very interesting challenge.
Yeah, I've had to use a lot of personal leverage to get people to agree to review some of our pieces.
Yeah, I bet.
That's where you threaten to break their arms and.
Yeah.
That's what you mean by personal leverage?
I mean, I had to call in favors and this kind of. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So thank you
so
much,
it seems
everyone.
to me that we've reached a point where we can perhaps conclude that graphic science, it may be not at a low ebb, but not looking for the next milestone. But also, I think the conversation was a clear demonstration that the potential that was seen in the early 2010s is still there. The potential to try and use comics to do science differently and to do things that traditional prose articles would not do. And also, we are very happy to have a collection on the comics grid. Needless to say.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Paula, I think your microphone is off.
Thank you, Ernesto, Nicolas, and Peter for this really great conversation, and thank you to all the attendees for attending this event. And I hope you all have a great, if you are having a break now, the Easter break, I hope you are having a great holiday and see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, see you soon. Oh, look, Paul was here. Thank you, Paul. I'll click on the link before we lose the chat. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's very nice to see names that we know and names that we don't. It's been brilliant to have you. Thank you, Paula, for accommodating us within such short notice. Yeah, you were brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.